Chapter 26. Fight of Their Lives. Every nerve in Karnik's body was alive, every sense amplified to its maximum. The moonlight gleamed off the shattered glass, turning the shards into twinkling stars, suspended in the night as they hurtled towards him. His heart thudded so loudly in his chest, he was sure the approaching adversaries could hear it. The world around him seemed to have taken on a surreal, liquid quality, where every second stretched into an eternity. The sharp, metallic smell of gunpowder filled the air as his M4 discharged. The noise was deafening, but Karnik felt disconnected from it. He watched, as though from a distance, the lead figure stagger back, his eyes wide in shock, then collapse to the ground. The path was far from clear, however. Two more figures, just as lethal, stepped into the light. The eerie luminescence of the scene painted an almost ghostly atmosphere. Behind him, the soft shuffle of his men's movements reminded Karnik that he wasn't alone in this desperate gambit. But the weight of their mission, the gravity of their purpose, rested heavily on his shoulders. It was an intense game of cat and mouse, and one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. Every step forward felt like pushing through a wall of thick, resistant water. Karnik's footsteps, despite the high stakes, remained precise and measured. The staccato of gunfire sang its own symphony on either side of him. Bullets whistled by, cutting through the air, their lethal potential evident with every sharp sound. The formation around him resembled a phalanx from ancient times, with him at the forefront. Every soldier in that group moved in tandem, their steps harmonized despite the chaotic atmosphere. As the double doors loomed ahead, every fiber in Karnik's being screamed to make a dramatic entrance. The urge to kick them open, to charge inside with guns blazing, was almost overpowering. He was almost in motion when a niggling memory stopped him. Those doors, they opened outward. His foot hung mid-air, a split second from delivering a powerful kick. Adjusting swiftly, Karnik sidestepped, reining in his instinct and opting for a more strategic approach. It was these minute details, these brief moments of recalibration, that separated the experienced from the rookies. The skirmish outside might be intense, but what lay beyond those doors was anyone's guess. Karnik's hand clasped the cool door handle, his movement controlled yet unforgiving. He wrenched it open with a vigor that would have shattered the glass, had it not already succumbed to the prior onslaught of bullets. Simultaneously, his soldier to the right mirrored his actions, and together they breached the threshold, eyes fixated on the gore-strewn corridor before them. 3 men lay splayed on the ground, each punctuated with a myriad of bullet wounds. Their chests heaved in a futile struggle for life, eyes barely clinging to consciousness. Karnik's gaze was as cold as it was calculating. They were no longer a threat. His arm, firm and authoritative, dispatched a silent signal to 4 of his men. Immediately they positioned themselves, rifles trained steadily down the hallway from which the wounded had stumbled. Karnik moved ahead, a squad flanking him as they pressed on towards the gym, the room they knew to hold a trove of potential hostiles. His boots moved over the cold floor, every step echoing in the semi-darkness, intertwining with the distant sounds of agony and the faint, ominous murmurs from the gym ahead. Each silent footstep punctuated by the irregular cadence of their collective breathing. Karnik's heart, steadfast and unyielding, barely betrayed the surging adrenaline that coursed through his veins. Every shadow promised threat, every sound within the cavernous building whispered of danger. And yet they moved forward, into the maw of the unknown. Karnik's footsteps slowed as he approached the gym. The very thought of firing upon his fellow countrymen, even if they donned peculiar uniforms, was a burden weighing heavily on his soul. He tried to push away the creeping nausea, reminding himself of the necessity of their actions. But the grim reality loomed large. Lives had been taken, and the cost of this operation was rapidly mounting. The sight of 5 men barring their path only intensified the dread. The central figure stood imperiously before the secured gym doors, his silhouette framed by 2 guards on either side, all armed and vigilant. Their steadfast determination reflected in the gleam of their weapons. The conundrum was glaringly obvious. Open fire, and risk bullets piercing through the flimsy gymnasium doors, possibly hitting the very men they were there to rescue. Hold back, and they could be cut down by the guards in a heartbeat. A tense stillness enveloped the corridor. every eye fixed, every trigger finger poised on the precipice of action. But Karnik's mind raced, calculating options, searching for a way to defuse the situation. The choices were stark, and the potential price of a wrong move devastating. The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity, each second stretching the limits of Karnik's resolve. He had to make a call, and fast. With all their fingers at the ready, each of them demanded, "Lay down your weapons." At that same moment, on the other side of the armory, Lee's heart pounded in his chest, each thud hardened by the cries of his fallen comrades. The acrid smell of gunpowder, burnt rubber and blood assaulted his nostrils. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, trying to find the stillness within him that had kept him going through years of training. Tears threatened to blur his vision, but he fought them back. These men had trusted him to lead them, and he had promised to bring them back. Every loss, every scream, every face contorted in pain, carved deep scars on his soul. Lee could also see the resilience of his squad. Those who could move dragged themselves into cover, even as they tended to their own wounds. They shielded the fallen, still determined to fight, even as they gritted their teeth against the pain. He realized it was these very moments of adversity that defined a soldier, not just the discipline of drills or the perfection of a firing range shot. It was the grit and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, the undying will to protect and serve, the unyielding belief in the mission. Swallowing hard, Lee squared his shoulders, gripped his rifle tighter, and turned to face the entrance of the armory. His gaze was unwavering, purpose coursing through his veins. He knew that the real battle had only just begun, and he wasn't about to let the sacrifices of his men be in vain. The mission was still very much alive, and he was going to see it through. Lee's hypnotized state at the horrific sight was broken with a sudden force that pulled him and another soldier just off to his left down the steps. Men who were lying face down on the steps reached up and grabbed hold of his gear and pulled him out of the line of fire. To Lee, everything was happening fast. This must be what clothes feel like in a washer, he thought, as he slid down the steps. On the way down, he tried to take a deep breath, but found none. Lee gasped, the burn of his lungs clawing desperately for air, grappling against the disorienting void that threatened to swallow him. His vision flickered, the world black at the edges as he staggered, almost toppling. His thoughts spiraled into a chaotic swarm of regret and unspoken words. His girlfriend's face shimmered in his mind's eye, her smile an ephemeral fragment in the encroaching darkness. A jagged inhale, short, stunted, then another. The darkness receded bit by bit as precious oxygen whispered through his veins. His body trembled, trying to reconcile the separation between imminent death and the survival his lungs clawed for. With every successive breath, life seeped back into him. Every molecule of air tasted like victory. A startling realization sprouted as his hand, slick with blood not his own, met the solid, unyielding surface of his vest. He was alive. The acrid sweetness of gunpowder and sulfur in the air never smelled so much like a second chance before. He staggered upright, each breath an echo of borrowed time, as he faced the landscape of war laid out before him. But this time, there was a new edge to him. The brush with death had filed away any last fragments of hesitation or self-preservation. He was a ghost, a revenant that had slipped from death's loose grip. He squared his shoulders, the sharp, visceral relief tangling with a newfound resolution, and plunged back into the melee with unbridled fury. His mission, now tainted with the blood of his comrades and the spectre of his own mortality, took on a weight and sanctity it hadn't possessed before. It was no longer merely a task, but a consecration of every faltering breath he drew into his lungs. The battle raged on, but so did Lee. Lee could hear nothing but the ringing in his ears from rifle shot. It struck him, oddly detached, how the deafening roar of guns barely registered when one's very existence was on the line. With a wary grace, he slid to the dewy grass beside the steps, making his way up the incline. The doors, riddled with bullet holes, seemed more like tissue than barrier. Their integrity was questionable at best, with shattered latches that hinted at their compromised state. While the glass had been obliterated at both ends, the embedded wire mesh had ensured that menacing shards, like the maw of some predatory beast, remained in place. Regaining his vantage point at the top, the severity of the situation crystallized for Lee. A sinking feeling gnawed at him as he contemplated the potential casualties they might suffer just trying to breach these doors. His desperate eyes darted around, seeking an alternative route. Most of the building's front windows had been blown out, but their slender vertical design meant they were far from ideal for armored soldiers to squeeze through. The daunting realization hit him. The doors were their only plausible entry. Refocusing, Lee hoisted his rifle, aiming precisely at the door hinges. Each bullet's impact sent a shiver through the metal. He mentally calculated the ammunition required to dismantle the stubborn barrier. By the time the dust settled and the final hinge lay wasted by 2 full magazines, an unsettling thought plagued him. Such a hefty expenditure of bullets for mere hinges felt like a squandered resource in a situation already teetering on the edge. Reaching for his pouch, the scant weight of the 2 remaining magazines felt more ominous than he'd hoped. As he verified their contents, a dark spherical object caught his eye, plummeting from above. An overwhelming surge of adrenaline made him hyper-aware, and his combat instincts kicked into overdrive. The menacing object, a grenade. But before the panic could fully register, the soldier next to Lee executed a powerful kick, sending the grenade skidding across the pavement like a discarded ball. Almost simultaneously, another of Lee's men unleashed a barrage of gunfire towards the rooftop, hinting at the grenade's origin. The distant thud and subsequent explosion left a smoldering Silverado in its wake. Lee turned to the man, the improvised kicker, with an impressed nod and remarked, "Score!" But almost immediately, his attention snapped back to the battered armory doors and the pressing urgency of their mission. Lee prayed for his plan to work. Looking down to the men firing just over the top step through the doors, he signaled for them to stay. He motioned for the men behind them to stack on him. Filled with anxiety and adrenaline, they quickly moved and gathered to his rear. They were ready to go. Lee reached out to the door with his K-bar knife in hand. Slowly he put it in the space between the door and its frame. Working the blade just a little at a time so as not to break it, he pried the door away little by little. As he pried, Lee could feel the tip of his blade snap. Little by little it dug in, and the door moved free from its frame. His idea was working, and in a few seconds the door would be free. Bullets passed through the doors from the inside, and his men sent them back in response. Lee swore he could feel the heat as the hot lead screamed past. Now it was time. There was enough separation to pull the door the rest of the way. Looking back and using his peripheral vision, Lee gave the man to his rear a nudge with his elbow, letting him know it was time, and he in turn sent the nudge on down the line. It wasn't long before his nudge was returned, and at that moment, Lee could feel fear coming on strong, not for his own life, but for the lives of the men who were about to die entering the doorway. With his fingers quickly pressed between the door and the frame, with all his strength Lee pulled, and the door came free. As the door hit the concrete, Lee was already on his way through the opening, all the others inches behind him. Now he didn't just think he could feel the heat from the bullets, he was certain.